Hey, Sam here. So, going back through the edits for this podcast, I realized that instead of doing our normal messing around intro, I was going to have to record this apology because the squeaking of my chair is incessant in this episode. I tried my very best to edit around it and cut out as much as possible and minimize the sound while we were talking, but it is still very evident. So I just want to apologize for that. And yeah, I will have gotten a new chair in a couple of weeks from when this podcast was recorded. I have this new chair now. So hopefully there will be no future squeaking problems. But yeah, just a little warning there. I don't blame anyone if it bothers you too much to listen to, but my editing skills aren't good enough yet to edit around it. So yeah. Sorry, everyone. Now to the actual podcast.
Hello, are we on air? I think so.
We are. I've been recording for the past minute.
Hello, is this on?
We are live and ready to go. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Excellent. Ready to talk about some films or a film, movie,
A film.
moving
I'm
picture, talkie.
The talkies. The talkies.
As the kids say.
The motion pictures. The cinematics.
Technicolor. Technically, I don't even know if it's a Technicolor movie. Probably not, because that's a copyright thing, I think. So, we watched a really good movie about 7 dudes. 7 dudes in a room.
I like how we said we're going to stop doing the 6-word summary, and then you're like, ooh, but mysterious 7 dudes in a room.
And one old dude, plus some extra dudes.
You're making it sound like a much weirder movie than it is.
Because I was thinking, technically it's a lot more dudes than 7 dudes. You know,
yeah,
it's
no, there's
7
many
plus
more dudes.
7 dudes plus 2 dudes plus 2 or 3 dudes plus 1 dude plus dudette.
You got done?
Well, I could go on. I can pull up a picture and start duding and dudetting everyone I know. We watched the trial of Chicago 7.
There you go.
Sorry, you go.
If we actually post the episode where we talked about the Oscars, then everyone knows already that we watched the trial of the Chicago 7. And everyone probably figured that that's what we were going to talk about this time.
Well, you never know. It might also be, hang on, I can't remember, Ocean's 11, but that's not 7 dudes, is it? Nope.
No, it's not.
11? Nope. Anyway, moving on. Please tell us what the film is about, Sam.
I can do that. The Trial of the Chicago 7 is a film directed by Aaron Sorkin and written by Aaron Sorkin, as is a surprise to no one. If he directs something, he probably wrote it. And it's a film inspired by an actual trial of a group of people referred to as the Chicago 7. So in 1968, there was a very large protest in Chicago against the Vietnam War that brought thousands of people to Chicago, and it ended in a series of riots between protesters and police. And there was a lot of back and forth about who actually started the riots and the violence that ensued in the city. So about 5 months after the protests, 7 people, well, actually 8 people, Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, Tom Hayden, Rennie Davis, David Dellinger, Lee Weiner, John Froines, and Bobby Seale were charged with trying to incite a riot. They were charged with a very specific law that no one has ever been charged with before and no one has ever been charged with since. That is called the Rep Brown Law. This film follows the trial that happened with the 8 of them. That was not a very good summary.
Well, I think it describes a bit more than my 7 dudes in a room just hanging for like a year,
just
just
chilling.
chilling, hearing a bunch of racist people speak.
The film goes back and forth between the trial and then a certain amount of flashbacks and actual historical footage of the riots that occurred and pieces together a story of what happened at the riots while simultaneously going through the events of the trial, how they transpired and how the trial concluded.
It got 6 Academy Award nominations. For I can't count anymore. 5 Golden Globes, from which it won Best Screenplay, and 3 BAFTA Award nominations in Best Film and Best Screenplay and Editing. And then Sacha Baron Cohen got actually an Oscar nomination and a Golden Globe nomination on Best Performance by an Actor in Supporting Role. It didn't win any Oscars, but it was nominated, and
I was a bit surprised that it didn't win anything. Not like the films that did beat it were undeserving or anything, but to be nominated for 6 Academy Awards and not get any of them.
yeah, because like they were nominated for Best Motion Picture, Best Performance by an Actor in Supporting Role against Sacha Baron Cohen, Best Original Screenplay, Best Achievement in Film Editing, Cinematography, and then Best Song or Original Song. The editing was really interesting because like at times it was pretty slow and it gave space for the scene to just linger, which is I think it had also very slow moments, just people sitting, and then very fast cuts. But we can talk about that a bit later. I think it's good if we start with how the film starts.
So how does the film start?
It starts with newsreels about the Vietnam War, showing napalm and the draft and the lottery, and to kind of show maybe the viewer that it is an actual story and it's situated in that current era. And then from the newsreel, it transitions into these kinds of short introductions into the 7 main characters. You get kind of, well, yeah, you could say bullet points of their ideals and their plans to all go to Chicago and protest. You also see them kind of talk about one another in their own intros to kind of also show that they are in a way linked, although they are 7 different people who stand behind 7 different organizations that all want to go protest in Chicago. They still know each other and are linked through that common goal of ending the Vietnam War.
Yeah, it sets up their kind of character motivations and then some of the relationships that they have to each other, good and bad.
It is a very like traditional way to start a kind of an ensemble film, to have those kind of short introductions of every character, so the viewer doesn't have to really do work. It's probably easier to just have those short intros in the beginning, because then when the actual story begins, which is the trial, because the riot isn't the actual story, which in the beginning you might actually think it is, because the whole intro or the first scenes are building towards this huge protest in Chicago. And then after everyone's been introduced and they're like, yeah, let's go let's go protest, it's going to be great, basically, it transitions into a courtroom.
Yeah.
And the riot's already over, or the protest is over, and it's been a year already.
Yeah. It's very interesting how they set it up, because I wasn't expecting that. The film begins with, like you said, these 7 different perspectives, and there's a lot of cutting back and forth and establishing who people are. And that creates such momentum that the film has, and it's building and switching, and we're going to Chicago. Like there's 8 different versions happening of we're going to Chicago. And then you actually don't see
Chicago.
anyone, in Chicago. You don't see this. You see the build up, and then the event that they're building up to gets cut out, because what the film is actually building up to is the trial and the revelation of the events of the protests and the riot is sort of breadcrumbed all the way through the trial. And we get bits and pieces of the protests and how they turned into riots as the film moves on, which, I mean, we have to have that to like answer the questions of what happened and why is everyone on trial in the first place. But part of the film's central idea seems to be that what actually happened, like the minutia of the protests themselves, has less to do with the trial than you may think, right? And
Yeah.
so when we're building in the beginning, they don't have to show the riots in their entirety at the beginning because that's not what it's about. It's about the trial.
Yeah, because like several times during the film, they also state that this is a political trial and not a criminal one. So it really doesn't matter what happened because the actual thing that they are on trial over, the riot or protest, or depending on whose perspective you would be looking at the situation, is
Yeah.
it doesn't really matter. Like you said, it's technically they are on trial of inciting a riot and crossing state lines to do so, but in actuality, it's not what they really are on trial for.
Yeah.
And that's why
Yeah.
the protest itself doesn't really matter, except key parts that get shown.
Yeah, and I mean, what speaks to that is like a key point that they set up in the film and then expand upon later is that this trial happens so long after the riots, in big part because we get a change in administration and Nixon is elected, and all of a sudden, these people who quote unquote organized riots, and I use air quotes here as if anyone can see those. These people are only now being charged, and that speaks to, like how you said, referring to it as a political trial.
But it's a very like clever way to start a film because you think, okay, yeah, cool, it's gonna be a type of like anti government, anarchy, people protesting, stick it to the man type of film from the start, and then it just ends without any kind of, like you said, the whole beginning hypes up for this huge protest where thousands and thousands of people are gonna come and then it's not shown. So it's a very clever way to start the film in a way that as a viewer you get that feel like, okay, hang on, like what is this about? Why am I watching? Like what is happening? You're hooked.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's in part a reflection of wanting to put the emphasis on the actual issues that these people were there to protest in the first place, right? Because what happened to these protests is they were supposed to be at the Democratic National Convention, and kind of their point of demonstrating outside the Democratic National Convention was that whoever the Democrats were going to nominate at that point wasn't progressive enough for these groups of people. And it would be a place that they could protest to not only say that, but also a place where they would have the media traction, or they would have the media around to get the type of traction and attention that they wanted to these issues. And because the protests devolved into violence and riots, they weren't able to get the point across that they wanted to get across, which was we shouldn't be in the Vietnam War. And that kind of core issue to them got overshadowed. And so this film focuses on the trial almost as kind of like a second attempt to redirect back to the issues at hand. And so there's this constant struggle in the film between the reality of the trial and going to jail versus the original character motivations that are set up in the beginning that you were talking about, right? Because they're all talking about go to Chicago and the war, go to Chicago and the war, like all different versions of that. And then we build up, don't get the riots, and instead go to the trial. And so that's kind of like the main tension.
Yeah, a very clever way to start. Although, like the film is called The Trial of the Chicago 7, but with the start you would assume that you see the characters, then you see the crime, then you see
Mhm.
the trial, and then you see
Yeah.
victory at the end. Like that is the stereotypical courtroom film.
Yeah.
We only know about the riot, or yeah, the riot and then the protests through flashbacks, newsreels,
Mhm.
and someone talking about it. So as a viewer, you don't witness it. It's always through someone else's lens.
Maybe that's in part a reflection of how the actual events happened, right? Because these protests happened in 1968, and there's just not as much documentation of that event as there would be if it happened today, right? Not everyone has cameras or recording devices or anything like that. And so actual footage of the protests themselves and the violence that occurred, it exists, but not in the same abundance as it would if it were happening today.
Yeah,
Whereas the trial, right, the trial is documented. There's someone in the courthouse writing everything down, and there's people there drawing, and there's photographs, and there's all sorts of media attention that happens right outside the courthouse building. And so this is an event that's much more well documented than the thing that it's actually about. So we only get the story of the riots as mediated through, yeah, these kind of constructed flashbacks and some of the testimony of the characters, and then the historical footage, which I know you wanted to talk about, Anna.
yeah. The the historical footage mixed with the film footage was mainly shown in the start when it was pictures of Vietnam War, and then every time the riot was shown, they were combined with cinematic images of the riot happening with real news recordings of the riot. It was kind of a mix between this kind of the actors acting the riot and then quickly switching to a newsreel and then quickly switching back to a cinematic version of it. Also, it was used when the character of Fred Hampton died or was killed.
And just for context, Fred Hampton isn't one of the 8 people originally on trial.
No,
He was the head of the Black Panthers Illinois chapter.
yeah, and a close consultant of Bobby Seale, who was a member of the
Who,
Black Panther. Was the leader,
yeah.
I guess? No?
Yeah, he was,
Yeah.
I think, at that point. And he was included in this trial at first, but it's referred to as the trial of the Chicago 7 because his inclusion in these charges was eventually dropped because it became clear that it was his inclusion was really just racially motivated. He was only actually in Chicago for 4 hours around the time of the events of the riots. He hadn't met any of the other people who were on trial, so his involvement was eventually dropped. And there was thought that he was just included in this specific trial to make the whole defense and everyone seem quote unquote scarier and less trustworthy to a jury. Yeah, to play on people's racist stereotypes to scare the jury by having a black man on the
Not
defense.
even just a black man, but a Black Panther.
Yeah.
But yeah, they use newsreels to reflect the brutality of everything that happened, because the whole trial itself is just so absurd in a way and kind of a parody of a real trial that it almost feels like it needs these snippets of reality to kind of indicate to the viewer, or at least that's how I felt it, that it was kind of a tool to bring back that severity and the fact that it actually did happen. The fact that the whole trial is so absurd, combined with the flashbacks with the newsreels and everything, it's just it creates this kind of heavy atmosphere because like you're watching a very mock trial, basically a joke for the whole system of democracy, and then constantly being reminded that this is actually happening, like kind of using those real police shots or crime scene shots of people being like beat upon by police, and riot images, and then images of Fred Hampton's body. It just creates a very like harsh contrast with the kind of softness and cinematically beautiful film with these kinds of hard realities of what was the Vietnam War, what was police brutality, and kind of images that are very relevant in our current time.
Yeah.
I do think that it was very important for them to have like actual images of the happenings, and also to kind of bring a different view over the images. It's not something that a director or a screenwriter wrote. It's not their. Obviously, it is edited and curated, chosen very carefully which clip is in this film, but it still gives kind of a new perspective and a new. It's someone
Yeah.
else's lens and someone else's shot of a situation. In
Yeah.
in Fred Hampton's crime scene shots, it's the police that have taken the images. I don't know, maybe at that time also some news, and then the riots by news organization, like the newspaper, yeah, and then images of Vietnam, which are very widely spread. What I understood that the Vietnam War was actually like one of the first wars that were actually broadcasted on TV,
Yeah.
and you could actually see the horrors live on TV in a way. Anyway, every time they kind of use those newsreels, it was a very fast reminder of, oh wait, this is not just a movie, but this actually happened.
No, I think you're right in that the use of the historical footage interspersed with Sorkin's view of this trial not only adds another perspective, but also, yeah, it helps ground it in a way and remind you that, you know, it's not pretending to be a documentary, but it does remind you that these things happened, that they were really things that occurred, right? Fred Hampton was really killed by the police, and he was really shot in the shoulder and then shot in the head. And as they say in the film, you can't aim a gun if you've been shot in the shoulder. And, you know, some of these horrific events, Bobby Seale being gagged and bound in court, that really happened. People being brutally beaten during the riots, that really happened. It works as an effective reminder of all of that.
Yeah, and then it kind of also emphasizes, because like the newsreels are in black and white mainly. Like in the start, there are images of Vietnam, and a lot of them are also in color, but most of the reels are in black and white. It kind of enhances the warm tones and the in the color scheme softness. I think you had some points about that,
Yeah,
like the film
definitely,
coloring.
because it's shot with warm tones and warm light, and it doesn't necessarily take away from the brutality that's happening, but it does give it a different feel and a different look. And it is a very Hollywood styled film, right? Even when people look bad, they kind of look good, type of thing. And the warm tones also makes it a little bit more accessible, I think. How the courtroom looks is shot very warm and close up. The conspiracy office, where the Chicago Seven sort of hang out and have discussions with their lawyers and things like that, is shot very intimately, and it feels quite cozy in a way. And the whole film is shot like this. Even the flashbacks to the riots are in these type of warm tones. But what I thought was interesting is where they break from that style of filming. And in my viewing, and I 100% recognize that I completely could have missed something, right? And these breaks could have happened at other points. but it stood out to me that this warm tone was so pervasive until the scene where the audience and the other characters find out that Fred Hampton was killed. And how this is structured is, like you said, Anna, it's the characters finding out interspersed with these crime scene photos. Then we cut to a scene with the lawyer for the Chicago Seven, Tom Hayden, and then Bobby Seale. And Bobby Seale is being held in prison at the moment. And the lawyer and Tom Hayden go to visit him to tell him that Fred Hampton has been killed.
Fred Hampton was shot and killed last night. There was a police raid, and there was a shootout, and he's dead. It took place between the hours of 4 a.m.
I know.
You were told?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
The 7 of you, you've all got the same father, right? I'm talking to you. You all got the same father, right? Cut your hair. Don't be a fag. Respect authority. Respect America. Respect me. Your life, it's a fuck you to your father, right? A little. Maybe. And you can see how that's different from a rope on a tree.
Yeah.
Yeah. He was shot in the shoulder first. You can't aim a gun if you've been shot in the shoulder. You can't squeeze the trigger. Second shot was in his head. Fred was executed.
This whole scene, which takes place in what looks like a meeting room in the prison, is shot in these very cool tones as opposed to all of the warm tones that we've been seeing everything else in so far. Yeah, the whole setting of this is kind of cool white and gray, and the walls are a little bit bluish type of slate gray, and the lighting is a lot colder and it looks a lot less welcoming. And we get this relatively short scene with Bobby Seale and the lawyer and Tom Hayden. And they attempt to tell him that Fred Hampton has been killed, and Bobby informs them that he's already been told. And we get this really brilliant short monologue where Bobby talks to Tom Hayden, and he says to him, you know, you guys who are on trial right now, the reason you're protesting is sort of like a rebellion against the way that you were raised. And Tom Hayden sort of agrees with this. And Bobby Seale tells him, and you can see how that's different from a rope hanging on a tree, which is an incredibly poignant line. And is Bobby Seale pointing out the fact that it's pointing out his separation from the other 7 and making a commentary on his inclusion in this and how he has a lot more at stake than the others do. And from the beginning, his inclusion in this trial is a reflection not on anything he did and not really on his political opinions, but on his race and position as a Black man in America at the time. And I think how this scene is shot in these cold tones reflects what Bobby is saying and that distance and how his position is different from everyone else's. And it's shot that way. His position is shot in this cold prison meeting room, and everyone else's is shot either outside or in the conspiracy office or in the trial, but it's all shot very warm, and it gives them a completely different positioning.
Yeah, it makes sense because the only instances that we do see Bobby Seale is either just in the courtroom or then in the prison.
Mhm.
And if I remember correctly, he was in the beginning when everyone got their intro and he was leaving his home to go protest. I think that was warm.
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
I think he was with some of the other Black Panthers and he was talking about leaving to go to Chicago.
Yeah.
And that was also shot warm. And I think part of that is like it doesn't betray yet his role and how it's completely different from everyone else's.
Yeah.
It sets him up as one of
The protesters.
as sort of, yeah, on equal footing. And throughout the trial, you realize just how little his inclusion in the trial has anything to do with his role in protesting or his political opinions, but just the fact that he was a Black man in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah. What I also want to point out as a very interesting, because like the whole trial, as I said already, was depicted in a very like it's not even depicted. It's a joke of a trial, because like as David Dellinger, one of the 7, played by John Lynch, he was stating that, talking to the judge, that he had already just decided their fate, and if this was a fair trial, why not give them a trial, referring to the fact that it was just not really a trial. It was, everything was already set up, and every time the 7 got kind of a good like witness or whatever, they got just dismissed or taken away, that they were not allowed to show some evidence. So I kind of thought that it was a good way to reflect the whole absurdity that was the trial, to have the most of the narration of the riot and everything that happened and how the trial went through happen in these kinds of stand-up bits between scenes. Like you had the character of Abby Hoffman, played by Sacha Baron Cohen, do stand-up, and through this stand-up tell the story of the trial and of the riots.
Right. Inside the bar, it's like the 60s never happened. Outside the bar, the 60s were being performed for anyone who looked out of the window.
I don't know what a Buckeye is.
Buckeye?
Yeah.
A Buckeye is a nut. A poisonous nut.
Hey. Am I the only one who sees what's going on out there?
And we see a cop do something you don't ever want to see a cop do. 60s outside the bar, 50s inside the bar. And then an unnecessary metaphor.
It's a nut.
What?
A nut.
Were you resisting arrest?
They pushed us through the window.
You overrun the riot police.
Which is more
Make
than
it
Rennie
past
can
the
say.
tear
Over
gas, make it
400
past the
people
National
admitted to
Guard,
area
find
hospitals
an
with
open
severe
bridge.
injuries.
You
They
can
had
practically
armored vehicles
reach your
and
hand out
bayonets.
and touch
They
the
took
convention.
off their
And what
name
you're
tags
telling
and
me,
badges.
you
We were
gave
trying to
yourself
protest
up
peacefully at
peacefully?
the fucking convention.
That kind of really, I think, sums up how absurd the whole trial was, to have it narrated as a stand-up joke, because like it's not like the things that he's saying, at least in the what the movie suggests, the things that normally you put in a stand-up show are mostly probably dramatized, or I wouldn't be surprised if most of the stand-up stories that you hear aren't really that, like maybe true some in some parts, but they have embellished them to make them funny. And to have a stand-up show kind of narrate a trial and then show that it actually went like that without any embellishment needed is just...
It's a clever way to point out absurdity.
Yeah. And then you realize, like, when you're listening to a stand-up show, you laugh and be like, okay, that's not... It's funny, but then in contrast with then the trial, what actually people said in the trial, and then the real images, it isn't that funny anymore.
No.
Just a very clever way to, like you said, emphasize the absurdity of what the trial was.
Yeah, there's a kind of staccato way that the film is operating where you get these bits of newsreel and then there's cinematics that's playing out in real time and then there's flashbacks and then they're not really flashbacks or flash forwards, they're just Abby Hoffman doing stand up and interviews and they sort of exist in the same timeline as the trial. So there's not really a difference, but they do function as narration in a way that the newsreels also sort of function as narration, but they're in this kind of tug of war and going back and forth and speaking to the kind of tension that exists not just between the characters but also the broader politics that are being negotiated in the film, right? Because you have the seriousness of what's happening and then the view that if it's a serious thing it should be taken seriously and addressed seriously, which is sort of Tom Hayden's perspective, at least in this film.
Yeah.
And partially, in real life Tom Hayden did actually go on to be a career politician, versus the Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin type perspective where we get this idea of, well, this trial is so absurd and they've already decided that we're guilty because of our politics, because this is a clearly politically motivated trial, right? We're only put on trial because now Nixon is president and he doesn't agree with what we did, even though at the time of the riots we were never charged. So let's treat this absurd thing absurdly, and that way we'll get attention and we can focus that attention on what we actually care about, which is stopping the Vietnam War. The film is just playing out that tension in a bunch of different ways, and you see that cinematically.
Yeah, and what the Abby Hoffman stand-up bits, especially when you go towards the end, how he tells the story is a condensed version of what happened, and everything that he kind of leaves, everything that he doesn't say gets shown to the viewer. Like, for example, when he talks about standing in front of the restaurant and then saying, you never wanna, how did he put it? He said, like,
and then you see a cop do something you never
want a
wanna
cop to
see a
see
cop do.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then
I don't know if that's the exact
yeah,
wording,
but something in the
it's
lines
something
of
to
that. He never
effect.
states that the cops are going to take that they're taking their badges and their name tags off and everything, but you are shown that. It's a very, very powerful way to kind of first take away the context and have just a stand-up show and then show what's behind the jokes, almost
Yeah.
in the same way as the newsreels operate, like a reminder to the viewer that this is hardcore stuff, this is horrible things happening, people are getting hurt, killed, and it's not just all jokes and gags.
Yeah. And I mean, we've been talking about the narration, and when we say narrating, it's like narrating without narrating, right? Because it's happening as these other scenes and you see Abby Hoffman doing this stand up, but then it's sometimes playing over other scenes, so it's part narration and part actual events that are happening. But I guess speaking of this narration and how it plays with the visuals of the film, I don't know, this is the kind of stuff that really makes me like Aaron Sorkin as a writer, because I just think he's really brilliant at his craft and what he does. And I think, he directed this film as well, and I think he's finding his way as a director and melding kind of his writing with the visuals of the film. What was interesting though, because when I watched this film, I thought that it felt a lot like a film that Sorkin was at least thinking about for a while, because almost all of Sorkin's writing has these political elements in it and debates. He wrote The West Wing for a really long time, which is, in its plot about politics in the White House. He wrote The Newsroom, which is about the news covering politics. When I looked into it, apparently the screenplay for this film he actually wrote all the way back in 2007 and wasn't intending on directing it himself at all, because by that point he hadn't directed anything himself at all. But it was put on hold because of the writer's strike, and there were talks that Spielberg was going to direct it, and then that all just kind of fell away. Sorkin moved on to other projects in the meantime. That he did the Newsroom, Social Network, things like that, and it kind of came back into production in 2018, and he was announced as being the director for it. And I think it's interesting that it seems like something that he's probably been obsessed with for a while, because these politics and these people show up in so many of his other works. And I think it also plays out in how much care seems to have been put into how this story was told, because when you've been with a story that long, you have to care about it a lot in order to bring it to fruition, right? If you think about, he wrote the screenplay in 2007. He's been working on this film for 14 years in some way or another. It's been in his mind. And I think that shows in those details of how the writing meshes with the cinematography and how the narration happens through newsreels and through Abby's overlapping performance with the visuals and things like that. I just think it's all very clever.
Yeah, definitely. Or what I've heard you speak about it, because like I've seen Sorkin films and I've seen The Newsroom, but I've never watched West Wing, so I'm not really, I don't really have that great of knowledge of his in that way that I would be able to see hidden cues and Easter eggs and be like, oh, this is from here and this line is from there, and kind of see this as not a final work, but kind of a thing that he's been working on and building upon.
But speaking of The Newsroom, which you and I both watched, there are some direct lines from The Newsroom that Sorkin used in this film. But now it makes me think that he probably wrote these lines first for this film and then used them in The Newsroom, thinking he might not be able to ever make this film. And then they came back in this movie, which I think is interesting. There's, that brilliant line where Tom Hayden is criticizing Abby Hoffman.
Yeah.
And he says, I'm angry with you and I have a problem with you because you're going to be the face of progressive politics for the next 50 years, passing out daisies to soldiers and trying to levitate the Pentagon.
What did you mean by that?
I meant that you're making the most of your close-up.
Yeah?
No more war, no more Abby Hoffman.
What's your problem with me, Hayden?
I really wish people would stop asking you that question.
Dave wouldn't want us to
Answer it. One time.
All right. My problem is that for the next 50 years, when people think of progressive politics, they're going to think of you. They're going to think of you and your idiot followers passing out daisies to soldiers and trying to levitate the Pentagon. So they're not going to think of equality or justice. They're not going to think of education or poverty or progress. They're going to think of a bunch of stone-lost, disrespectful, foul-mouthed, lawless losers. And so we'll lose elections.
The legacy that Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin have left on democracy and progressive politics in the US. And, whether that's right or wrong, it does have an impact on how people view the party and those political views, right? And so it conflates these ideas of wanting free and good education and, equality for everyone with ideas maybe of dropping out and smoking weed, right? And like peace for everyone type thing.
Yeah. Out of context and like completely out of what we've been talking about, a thing that the mixture between the stand-up and then the film events kind of reminded me of Chicago, the musical, like the film version of it.
Interesting.
Because there is that where Roxy Hart sings about her crime, and you get, in a similar way, she sings about it in kind of a cabaret manner. And then you get those images of her shooting her lover. And also with all that jazz type of thing, you get flashback. Like, but it kind of like it brought me back to Chicago, which was kind of ironic in a way.
Yeah.
Just
Ironic
a
in name.
weird side note. I don't know.
Yeah.
Who knows? Maybe Sorkin was a Chicago fan and was like, "Ooh, neat trick. Gonna do that."
Yeah.
Kind of.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
he has written a lot of plays and things for stage, so
Yeah, well, that kind of switch between a stage performance with reality is kind of
yeah. I hadn't even picked up on that, but maybe that's a little nod to that kind of cinematography.
yeah, because like the movie was called Chicago. This happened in Chicago. Yeah. Anyway, this is just conspiracy, like a weird side note of being like, "Ooh."
Those things are really fun though, when you're like, but this thing is like this thing, and I see it. I see you. Like, that's what I felt like noticing those lines that were the same. I was like, I see you, Sorkin.
I know what I know what you're trying to do, and I like
I
it.
see you. Yeah, exactly. I'm here for it. It's good. Well done. But like, I see you. I know what you did.
Yeah, but other than that, I thought it was a pretty good movie.
Yeah, I definitely really liked it.
It did. It was a very, if you're a hardcore conservative who is very like pro Trump and that kind of, then you might not like this movie. You can very clearly see what point they're trying to make and whose side on the so-called like whose side.
Oh, definitely.
It is. It is pretty biased, which I don't mind because like I agree with his views.
I mean, his views also pretty much align with how it was determined in retrospect, like how the trial was treated in retrospect, right? The fact that they declined to actually retry anyone after they won their appeal.
Yeah.
So everyone sort of agreed that it was bullshit after all, you know?
Yeah.
The motivations behind charging them in the first place were so political and kind of an act of retaliation in and of itself.
Yeah, and executed by an incompetent judge or a racist incompetent judge.
Yeah. What I think is, again, maybe just me watching too much of Sorkin's films and TV shows, is the character of Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who's the main prosecutor in the trial. He's playing Richard Schultz is his name, the assistant federal prosecutor. So not the main prosecutor in the actual trial, but the main prosecutor that we focus on in the film. He's not given a ton of attention, but he's given probably more attention than you would expect. And he falls into that role that I've noticed Sorkin has in quite a bit of his writing, which is the sort of moderate conservative character. Sorkin seems to have at least one or two in everything he writes that's about politics. In the newsroom, that character is mostly fulfilled by Will, who's ostensibly the main character of the show, insofar as there is a main character of the show. In The West Wing, it falls to a couple of different people as the seasons progress, but sort of someone who has really clear set of values and who, even though they disagree with the other characters in whatever the film or television show is politically, there's still a sense of mutual respect. This prosecutor is portrayed as having values, and he acknowledges the fact that this trial is politically and racially motivated. And in the beginning, he's the one to point out to the audience that the law that they're being charged with in the first place was a law that was created to limit the free speech of Black activists in the South. So you have this character that's politically conservative, but not necessarily as socially conservative, and not really ever treated as though they're bigoted, but more being conservative in a sense of tending to be more economically conservative and probably voting Republican, but disagreeing with like the extremists on that side. And
Yeah, because he is painted as a person who values the law and holds it to a very high standard, and in a way that honors the law.
yeah, exactly.
And it's not really discussed that if the law is morally okay, or if it's racially biased, or if there's something wrong with certain laws or some regulations, that isn't really put into focus. It's more his, if he sees that the law is like this, then it is
Yeah.
correct.
Well, not even necessarily like sort of someone who respects the law, even if the law is wrong in that sense, but he doesn't think it's wrong to charge these people with the law because it's a bad law. I'm trying to get at like the distinction there, but he alludes to the fact that it is a bad and racially biased law, but that doesn't preclude him from being the lead prosecutor in a trial where he's using it to charge people and try and put them in jail. But you can see that he disagrees with the law, but that doesn't negate the fact that it is a law type of thing. And
Yeah.
so respecting these institutions, right, whereas the judge is clearly painted as very racist and racially motivated and unfair, the prosecutor in this case isn't painted as unfair necessarily, but someone who respects the law and is doing the job set forth.
Yeah.
And in the end, he's given a clear set of motivations and principles, which lends him an air of respectability, even if you don't agree with him. And he has points in his own personal philosophy which overlaps with those of the people that he's trying to prosecute, right? In the end, when Tom Hayden is reading out the names of the people who have died in the Vietnam War, the prosecutor stands up out of respect along with all of the defendants. And when he's questioned about it, he says, well, it's respect for the fallen. And so in that case, his views do overlap with those of the defendants, despite the fact that he's putting these people on trial. I just think it's interesting that Aaron Sorkin tends to have this character show up in his works over and over again, this sort of sympathetic conservative.
Yeah.
And it seems like from the little research I did on this one character specifically, like it seems like a lot of liberties were taken with that, and that this wasn't really the way that the prosecutor acted at all. But for the sake of the film and characterization and adding an extra element to the story, this prosecutor is turned into that figure that you see in a lot of Sorkin's writing, where they're conservative, but their politics can be understood as reasonable to someone who is progressive. And you even see that play out when the prosecutor runs into Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin outside of the courtroom. And Abby tells him, you know, I don't think that you're a bad guy. It's these two people on completely opposite ends of the political spectrum exercising an act of mutual respect. As progressive as Aaron Sorkin's politics are, he doesn't necessarily paint conservative as bad and progressive is good. And I think he usually does that through this like repeating trope of this conservative with principles character.
Yeah, I can see that. Painting a picture that not all conservatives are extremists in their views. And yeah, it's an interesting movie. I see why it got so many nominations, because it is worth watching. Definitely. It has some great kick-ass lines, quotes that probably are going to be seen on t-shirts, I hope. Some of them have so smart comebacks. I wish I were that smooth.
Definitely.
In real life.
The way Sorkin writes is how I wish I spoke.
Yeah.
There's definitely, in the same way A Few Good Men has like, you can't handle the truth. You know, there's definitely some of those moments in this.
Yep. Maybe my favorite moment was when the judge stated, to the two lawyers who were like representing the seven, because like one of the lawyers says outright that he's discriminating against Bobby Seale. That in the entire history of my career, no one has ever said that he would be operating on a racist standard. And then the second lawyer, I think it was Wineglass,
under-
says, let it state in the notes that I am the second one to call the judge out for being racist.
What do you want, Mr. Schultz? This is your sidebar.
Your Honor, at this time, the government would like to make a motion that Bobby Seale be separated from the rest of the... Yes, sir, please. A motion that Bobby Seale be separated from the rest of the defendants and this case be declared a mistrial.
You want me to give him his mistrial?
Of course, because you took that black guy and you made him a sympathetic character.
Mr. Kunstler, I have lived a very long time, sir. And you're the first person ever to suggest that I have discriminated against a black man.
Then let the record show that I'm the second.
I thought that was one of my favorite.
It was definitely a really good scene.
Yeah. And for the 3 listeners that we have, you can watch it on Netflix.
Yeah, that is one good thing, is it's out on Netflix.
Yeah.
So it's
So
much more easily accessible.
Yeah.
Than it would normally be.
Yeah. But yeah, go on and watch it. And do you have any last words, Sam?
I definitely recommend it to people for sure. There are some hard to watch moments, but I think it's a really good film.
Yeah.
And definitely, in a weird way, probably a good thing for Sorkin that he wasn't able to make this film in 2007, because I think it probably has a lot more power in 2021 than it would have back then.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's everything.
That is everything. And until next time.
What was that? Oh, was that you clinking a glass? Beautiful. Sounds like a tiny gong.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.